Numbers don't panic, people do. Let's look at the psychology driving today's market. A crowd can start acting on a pattern before anyone has shown that the pattern contains durable structure at all. The setup feels familiar. A repeated shape appears. More people begin noticing it. And suddenly the room behaves as though the visual formation itself already deserves strategic respect. That reaction is understandable. Human perception is built to detect structure quickly, especially in noisy environments where recognizing a true pattern can sometimes matter for survival or decision speed. The problem begins when recognition outruns validation. A shape feels coherent, so participants start treating coherence as evidence that the sequence behind it must carry real predictive information. Once many people do that together, the market does not need the pattern to be objectively strong. Shared attention alone can turn a weak visual cue into a temporary coordination point. So the opening question is not why people are foolish. It is why a pattern can influence collective behavior even when its predictive power remains unproven or modest at best. At the observable level, the crowd starts discussing the same formation, timing decisions around the same setup, and reacting as though the repeated shape already contains agreed meaning. That does not mean every noticed pattern is empty. Some recurring formations can reflect structure, incentives, or repeated behavior. The danger appears when visual familiarity is mistaken for statistical authority. A market sequence can look persuasive simply because the eye prefers order over randomness. The mind would rather compress noise into a recognizable story than leave the sequence unresolved. That preference matters because price movement produces endless visual material. With enough lines, turns, and pauses, something will eventually resemble a meaningful setup to enough observers at once. The social environment then amplifies the perception. Once others also notice the same formation, each participant gains confidence that the pattern must be more than a personal impression. What begins as perception becomes shared interpretation. What becomes shared interpretation can then start nudging behavior, even before the room has answered whether the pattern predicts anything reliably. To see the mechanism clearly, distinguish structure from recognition. Structure asks whether the sequence contains repeatable informational value. Recognition asks whether the sequence merely feels orderly and memorable to observers. Those two questions are related but not identical. A pattern can be easy to notice, easy to name, and easy to repeat while still offering little durable edge once conditions change. Apophenia is the tendency to detect meaningful connections inside ambiguity or randomness. In markets, it can appear when participants see intention, signal, or inevitability inside noisy movement, inside collective decision-making. The issue is not that the eye sees shapes. The issue is that the mind often promotes a noticed shape into a stronger claim before enough comparative testing has happened. Once promoted, the pattern becomes easier to discuss. It gets examples, anecdotes, and memory anchors, which makes it feel increasingly substantial inside group conversation, inside collective decision-making. That conversational fluency matters. A formation that can be described quickly often travels faster through a room than a careful statement about uncertainty, distribution, or limited sample strength. So the pattern gains influence, partly because it is visually compelling and partly because it is socially portable. People can coordinate around what they can repeat easily inside collective decision-making. At that point, the market is responding not only to data but also to a shared perceptual shortcut that compresses complexity into a form the group can rally around. The loop starts when a visible sequence catches attention. A few observers highlight the shape, and the shape earns more scrutiny than other interpretations simply because it is easier to point out. Extra scrutiny then generates more commentary. More commentary makes the formation feel established, which invites additional observers to treat the pattern as something they should already understand inside collective decision-making. As the audience widens, social proof builds. Participants start believing that widespread recognition itself is evidence that the pattern must matter, even though recognition and predictive strength are separate questions. That belief encourages behavior. More people watch the same trigger, hesitate at the same turning point, or adjust exposure around the same visual cue because everyone expects everyone else to care. Now the pattern gains temporary self-referential force. It can influence behavior because the crowd believes others will respond to it, not necessarily because the underlying sequence deserves that confidence. That self-reference is crucial. A weak signal can matter briefly if enough participants coordinate around the expectation that the signal will shape the next wave of collective reactions. The formation then looks validated by its own behavioral impact. Participants say it mattered because the market reacted, while missing that the reaction itself may have come from shared perception. Notice the feedback loop. Recognition attracts attention, attention attracts agreement, agreement changes behavior, and changed behavior makes the original pattern look more meaningful than it otherwise would have seemed. This loop can persist even when nobody claims certainty explicitly. The crowd only needs to give the pattern a little extra weight, and the accumulated response can still become visible. That visibility then feeds memory. The next time a similar shape appears, participants recall the earlier reaction and become even more prepared to treat the new pattern as important. So the market can gradually build a library of persuasive forms whose influence comes partly from repetition and expectation rather than from stable informational content alone inside collective decision-making. The less time the group spends comparing alternative explanations, the easier it becomes for the visible shape to dominate interpretation by default rather than by proof inside collective decision-making. This is why skeptical language matters. Saying a pattern is noticeable is very different from saying it predicts, and the crowd often slides from the first statement into the second one too quickly. Once that slide happens collectively, visual perception begins steering market behavior in ways that look analytical on the surface but remain partly social underneath inside collective decision-making. The mechanism, therefore, does not require a grand illusion. It only requires enough people to promote a noticed form from interesting to actionable before testing justifies the stronger claim. A structural counterpoint matters here. Some recurring formations may reflect real behavioral regularities, liquidity patterns, or institutional habits that make them more than pure visual coincidence under changing market conditions. That means skepticism should not become blanket dismissal. A visible setup can deserve attention when it maps onto a plausible mechanism beyond the mere fact that it looks familiar. There is also a rational exception. If participants can connect the pattern to observable positioning, incentives, or repeated behavioral responses, the form may carry more informational value than appearance alone. The limitation is that proving the difference is hard. Markets are noisy, contexts shift, and a pattern that sometimes aligns with behavior may still fail as a durable predictive rule. Another boundary is that collective perception is only one layer. Fundamentals, liquidity, leverage, and institutional mandates still shape price movement, so psychology does not replace structure or causality. That is why this framework must stay non-predictive. Seeing a persuasive pattern tells us something about what the crowd may focus on, not what price must do next. The useful distinction is between a pattern as social coordination device and a pattern as reliable forecasting tool. Those are different roles even when the same shape occupies both conversations. When the crowd blurs those roles, shared perception can acquire authority it has not yet earned statistically. That is the psychological opening this topic is trying to expose. Now we can answer the opening tension. A pattern can influence behavior because enough participants collectively treat it as meaningful, even before its predictive power has been demonstrated convincingly. The crowd is not responding to pure fantasy. It is responding to a visible form that is easy to notice, easy to remember, and easy to coordinate around socially. That is why temporary influence does not prove durable edge. A pattern may matter in the moment because people expect reactions around it, not because the formation reliably reveals future direction. The narrower claim is important. Shared perception can move behavior without validating the stronger belief that the pattern contains stable forecasting power across changing contexts and aggregate market behavior. Once the group separates those two ideas, it becomes easier to study crowd focus without turning crowd focus into technical certainty or hidden prophecy in aggregate market behavior. The loop weakens when participants ask what mechanism, if any, gives the pattern force beyond recognition, and what evidence would still matter if the shape were less visually persuasive. So the resolution is this. A crowd can react to a pattern because collective perception turns that pattern into a coordination point, even when the underlying structure remains uncertain or modest. The practical observation framework starts with language. Ask whether people are describing what they see, or quietly upgrading a noticed shape into a claim about what must happen next. Ask whether the pattern's authority comes from evidence, from a plausible market mechanism, or from the simple fact that many participants have become prepared to react to the same picture. Ask what alternative explanation received less attention because the visible formation arrived first. First impressions matter, especially when the first impression is unusually easy to share across a room. Ask whether the crowd is tracking structure or tracking its own expectation of collective reaction. Those are related questions, yet they are not the same analytical conclusion. Observe the social portability of the pattern. The faster it travels as shorthand, the more likely its influence includes coordination dynamics rather than pure informational strength. Separate recognition from validation. A formation can be memorable, plausible, and behaviorally relevant in the short run while still failing the stronger test of dependable predictive power. This framework does not teach chart trading or promise foresight. It simply studies how perception, repetition, and expectation can amplify one visual story inside a noisy market environment. This framework does not teach chart trading or promise foresight. It studies how perception, repetition, and expectation can amplify one visual story inside a noisy market environment. This framework does not teach trading or promise foresight. It studies how perception, repetition, and expectation can amplify one visual story inside a noisy market environment. When a pattern starts looking self-evident, ask whether the market found structure or whether the crowd found a picture it could coordinate around. Don't follow the herd, study it. See you next time.